So, I just saw Ricky Gervais's new special on Netflix titled Supernature, and it's not very good. Now, with just that one sentence, a good chunk of the 10 or so people who will end up seeing this video just think I made a political statement by not enjoying a stand-up special, and will assume I must have that opinion because I'm an ultra-woke soy boy who can't handle being challenged by a free thinker. So, if that's you, a couple things. That's a weird accusation to make because Gervais fans are not challenged by his material. They agree with him. Not only do they agree with him, but they can't stand so-called woke comedians, specifically because they are too annoyed with the politics to find the material funny. These people support Gervais because of the political targets he attacks, while at the same time pretending that politics are divorced from humor. Okay, that's what, 30 seconds into my supposed review, and I spent it complaining about a hypothetical group I made up who was complaining about me, instead of making a critique or a joke. But now I'm explaining that to you, so if you were to try and call me out on it, I'll say that that was the point and you got baited, and if you think this is insufferably smug and wasting your time, you now have a better understanding of why I didn't like Ricky Gervais's new special. I've never really been a fan of Ricky Gervais, not necessarily out of active dislike for his material, but just because I didn't typically like his kind of style, his vibe if we're being chill, or his ethos if your IQ is high enough to be a Ricky Gervais fan. So maybe I don't know as much about him as I probably should, but he looks like he really wants to fill the holes left behind by George Carlin and Richard Dawkins, and he just can't. He's not good enough. He's not good enough to stuff those holes. Not to divide the room here, but I think Ricky would identify as one of those edgy comedians. Here's my litmus test for an edgy comedian. If they tell an offensive joke on stage and then make their next joke about someone complaining about that joke, they're a self-identifying edgy comedian. And here's the thing about edgy comedians. The expectation that someone somewhere will be offended by a joke becomes part of the joke. It affects how an audience will respond because they'll have this new framing in mind, and that in turn affects how the comedian will structure the setup to allow for this new angle to the punchline. All of us love it when certain people or groups of people get knocked down a peg or two. Ridicule has always been a part of the comedic tradition. Hell, arguably comedy's most important role in free speech is its unique ability to mock worthy targets. And no matter your personal beliefs, you do consider someone a worthy target of mockery. However, those targets are worthy of mockery for a reason, and that reason is going to be the premise of the joke. There's no such thing as a joke about black people or gay people or women or whatever. The joke is about something they do or are perceived to do, with the punchline coming from why that something is bad or ridiculous. These people do this thing, isn't that silly? The disconnect between people who get offended at jokes and people who claim certain groups can't take a joke often comes down to a disagreement about whether or not that thing is true. Okay, enough skirting around it. Ricky is an edgy comedian in 2022, so of course he has a ton of jokes about what he thinks trans people are like, including the one joke.
I could have my legs removed, have wheels put on, identify as a pram, right? And if you sound mental, you're a bigot, right? Now,
one of the biggest comedians in the world got paid like $20 million to write that. They identify as something, so what if I identified as something? Yeah, cool. But that's just tired. The joke that got everyone calling him transphobic was this one.
No, it's the old-fashioned with it. And now the old-fashioned, they go like, oh, they want to use our toilets. Why shouldn't they use your toilets? For ladies. They are ladies. Look at their pronouns. What if he rapes me? What if she rapes you? You fucking turf whore.
The joke here is that people are worried more about misgendering than they are about actual sexual assault. It's not technically calling trans people sexual predators, but it plays into that fear as a necessary component of the premise. Ricky actually spells out exactly what logic he and a lot of other edgy comedians say they use when crafting offensive material to shield themselves from criticism. It's irony. The funny part is supposed to be he's saying something he obviously doesn't agree with, and that juxtaposition is what makes us laugh. Here's why that defense doesn't work. Your goal as a stand-up, believe it or not, is to make people laugh. Their input is what determines if a joke is successful or not, regardless of your opinion as the stand-up. Just like it doesn't matter whether you intended a joke to be funny, it also doesn't matter whether you intend a joke to offend someone or whether you intended to reinforce bigotry. Usually, that would mean we'll talk about how trans people, or whoever the target was, react to the joke, but I think it's more interesting to look at why the people who found an offensive joke funny think the way they do. It comes down to worthy targets and what makes them worthy. Ricky Gervais is an atheist, I hear. He has problems with religion, and he tells jokes from that perspective. Here's an example.
On Twitter, when they find out I'm an atheist, they go, "What, you don't believe in God at all?" I go, "No." Do you pray?" I go, "No." They go, "Why don't you pray just in case there's a God?" And I say, "Why do you put garlic over your door just in case there's a Dracula?" Right?
Now, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say this joke is not targeting the ridiculousness of religious belief. To find this joke funny, you kinda have to get on board with calling God a fictional character like Dracula to highlight the absurdity of truly believing in the former. People are different and comedy is subjective, but I think it's fair to assume that atheists will find this joke funnier than Christians, even if it is tired and obvious, which it is. The imagined offense of those self-righteous Christians is part of the joke. So let's return to that trans bathroom bit. It's possible that a trans or trans-friendly person can laugh at correctly gendering a rapist, but it's far more likely that someone who believes trans women are dangerous, sexually deviant men will get on board with the joke. Instead of asking whether comedians intend to offend people because of some internal bigotry we can't prove, it's often better to look at who is more likely to identify with their material. A famous example of this is Chris Rock's classic black people versus N-words joke. When he realized that a ton of racist white people were taking their own message from the joke, twisting his intended message and finding their humor in just straight up disparaging black people, he stopped doing it. You can't fully control what other people are going to take from your material. But if you didn't have at least an idea of why an audience would find something funny, you're probably not a good comedian, let alone one with a huge deal on Netflix. He knows his audience would be at least sympathetic to a transphobic stereotype and leaned into that for the joke. Again, that's not to say any group is off limits. It's all about what you're saying about that group, what is being reinforced, what subversion you're trying to introduce. He actually does make what I think could be a pretty good joke about trans women.
But what if I was a teenager now, in these really woke, progressive times, right? And I had really cool hippie parents, right? And I went, "Mother, father, I'm trans." Then there'd be like a montage, right? And I'd go to hospital, I'd have all the electrolysis, I'd grow my hair, right? I'd have a big fanny, I think. No. And then she'd go, "Do you want to come back to my place and les off?" I go, "Yeah, just a bit, right?" And then she'd go, "Oh, do you want to wear a strap-on dildo and give me a good seeing to?" I go, "Yeah, right." So I put a strap-on on, I put the big dildo there on my new fanny like that, and tie it at the back, and that's when I'd kick myself.
See, that was almost a good joke, if he hadn't spent way too long pretending to break during his dragging act-out of that joke. Let's define some terms here. The act-out is, as you might guess, the part of the joke where you act out the premise, usually taking on the role of another person, real or hypothetical. It changes the perspective, usually making it present tense, and shifts from a first-person oration to an audience into more of a one-person play with multiple characters interacting with each other, or at least one person reacting to a situation without an immediate audience in mind. When they work, they can add a ton of storytelling to a joke and give it layers that wouldn't exist otherwise. When they don't work, it's usually because they're just explaining the premise of the joke again, making it longer without adding anything. A lot of Ricky's act-outs feel like they're there for filler, to take up space in a set without expanding much on the premise or leading to a more complex punchline. There were a ton of times during the special where I just found myself thinking, dude, get to the point, make the actual joke over and over. Don't get me wrong, I love jokes with long lead-ups, and I love specials with slower pacing that focus on quality over quantity, but Ricky's act-outs just had me going, okay, I know where we're going, can we just get there already? This wasn't helped by his gratuitous breaking throughout these long act-outs. Breaking means appearing to deviate from the planned script. It most commonly refers to actors laughing in the middle of a skit, usually at something going wrong.
Uh-oh, I'm doing something called breaking.
Stand-ups have fewer moving parts and therefore more control over their shows, so you don't typically see them break unless they flub their delivery or someone in the audience does something unexpected. They don't laugh at their own jokes. One, they told these jokes dozens or even hundreds of times before they're up on stage being filmed for a special. And two, these jokes have been tinkered with and altered over and over to the point where the comedian knows them far deeper than allows for a spontaneous laugh when telling them. When Ricky laughs over and over throughout his delivery, he's doing it on purpose to add something to the joke. Jimmy Carr does this a lot too. You know what? Maybe I just don't like British people. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe Ricky really did get tickled with himself and the circumstances, and this was just a little peek into his process. But I'm not wrong. He was faking, and here's why. Stand-up, more than any other form of comedy, benefits from authenticity. It's just one person on a stage with a microphone talking to an audience. We know they exaggerate or fabricate stories, and we know they use hyperbole for comedic effect, but we still think on some level that that's a real person on stage showing us something about who they are. Ricky tends to laugh more during act-outs that could be seen as in bad taste, in order to humanize him a bit further, in the hopes that the audience will focus on how silly the premise is so as not to take it too seriously. The thing is, I feel like it's a crutch, like his premise and delivery weren't good enough otherwise to clue the audience into the tone he wanted to give. Here's an example. Prior to this, Ricky is talking about how people nowadays are trying so hard to out-woke each other that soon they'll be bending over backwards to accommodate pedophiles.
We'll get you into a facility at taxpayers' expense, right? And we'll wean you off children. How does that work, doctor? Well, you know, like when they give heroin addicts methadone, yeah? Well, we're going to start you on dwarves, right? It might work. It might.
I want you to imagine the joke without that little laugh he gives. To me, it would come off way too genuinely accusatory, like he actually believes that whatever amorphous conception of the woke people he's built in his head actually do want to bring pedophiles in under the umbrella of protected classes like we have for gay and trans people. At this point in the special, he's had a solid 20 minutes of material on trans people and AIDS, so it's not like the association would come out of nowhere. And he's well aware that, not even in the past, but right now, as we speak in 2022, a ton of people still associate LGBT people with groomers, that we target children to turn them into one of us. I think it's just a little bit too easy for even a charitable member of the audience who is familiar with and refutes that trope to see past it. Hence, that little giggle. It's him giving permission to you to laugh without buying into the darker side of the premise. But if you do believe that the queers target children, that little laugh does nothing to contradict your belief, and you can read it as someone finally calling out what's really happening. We're finally getting into my biggest problem with Supernature and Ricky Gervais as a whole: inauthenticity. He wants to be seen as someone who believes in something, who has a message to say in his comedy, like George Carlin or Richard Pryor, but with all the shielding that comes from not having a serious message. There's a line he says during this special that summed up my problem beautifully.
But they know I'm joking about all the other stuff, but they go, no, he must mean that, right? Like a joke is a window to the comedian's true soul. That's just not the case.
This is cowardice, plain and simple. This is the faux free speech gambit, where what you say doesn't really have any impact, but somehow it's still very important that you're able to say it. There's no point in putting offensive material into your set if it doesn't matter. And it does matter. You want to know how I know it matters? What would happen if someone told him to take it out? What if Netflix decided he couldn't make the joke about trans women raping cis women in bathrooms, or the one about free-range dwarves for pedophiles, or the one about comparing belief in God to belief in Dracula? There would be an uproar, and, kind of for good reason. It's important to be able to ridicule people. Free speech advocates would be right to point out that fascism censors ridicule and satire for a reason, and that reason is the power such things have in critique. And this is the problem with so many edgy comedians. Good material offends with a purpose that goes deeper than the offense, that seeks to say something via transgression. Good material gets someone to think a little bit more about a topic, a norm they hold that may deserve questioning. But when the goal is to be offensive, and it's just a matter of what road you take there, you tend to confirm preconceptions. The norm you're violating for the joke is just one of politeness, the relief of being an asshole and getting away with it. And you're usually shitting on a marginalized group to do it. If Ricky truly believed that his stand-up should not be a reflection on his character, then he wouldn't rely on irony for his jokes. Near the start of the show, he explained that an important part of many of his jokes is a mutual understanding that he doesn't literally believe in certain premises, but he says them anyway.
Okay, right. That was irony, okay? There's going to be a bit of that throughout the show. See if you can spot it, okay? Now, that's when I say something I don't really mean for comic effect, and you as an audience, you laugh at the wrong thing because you know what the right thing is. It's a way of satirizing attitudes.
If a core component of your comedy is the audience having a window to your soul, then yes, your jokes are a window to your soul. He says that in real life, he supports trans people, that he offends them to make them feel included because he makes fun of everybody. And honestly, I can respect that. Or at least I could. See, there's integrity in consciously going out of your way to offend everyone in order to bring us all down to a level playing field, to show that all of us are absurd in our own ways, to question our assumptions and core beliefs and show room for change and growth by admitting our faults. But this isn't that. This is just Ricky getting annoyed at people who rock the boat too much. Ricky wants people to laugh, at least partially, at the very idea that he's saying something offensive. It's a core theme of his special, and one that he draws attention to constantly. He even references the concept of punching up or down, of ridiculing the weak or the powerful, when he explains why it's not important for his offensive material to punch up. Comedy is built from a foundation of norms. Those norms are social and political. If you have aspirations to say something with your comedy, to comment on society and give a point of view, as Ricky does, then own it. He's an aging white millionaire. He cannot pull off the devious little scamp persona no matter how British he is. Giggling at the thought of offending people just reads as someone powerful relishing at the thought of being too above the masses to face consequences. Okay, those are my thoughts. Truthfully, I didn't think it was as explicitly hateful as some people on the internet made it out to be. It would almost be more interesting to talk about if it was. When he wasn't trying to be offensive, he was either recycling atheist jokes from 20 years ago, or he was struggling to think of fresh perspectives on mundane topics. I think this is just another legacy comedian who is getting frustrated with the changing perceptions of his audiences, and has leaned into those frustrations at the expense of writing better material. There are certainly people out there who will like this special out of principle, specifically because they think it offended the right people, but none of them are going to be able to say that it's a work of art that will be remembered in 20 years. So yeah, I didn't like it, and I don't recommend you watch it, but you can if you want to, so bye.